I think the principle of working on foundational learning is that from grade 4 onwards, you've learned to read and then you're reading to learn.
Today I have the pleasure of interacting with Omar Momin, who is the CEO of Godrej Foundation.
Once you identify a great tennis player or a badminton player, the kind of effort that goes into making them world champions is not to be underestimated. If you're doing something, is it better than if they didn't have this intervention? Is just such an important frame to think about in the assessment framework.
While talent is equally distributed, opportunity to nourish that talent isn't.
So acceleration, exposure, and a peer group, I think are three elements essential to this process. You often have things change just because you're measuring them.
Thank you for coming to EI Dialogues, Omar, and it's a pleasure having you here. Hello, and welcome to EI Dialogues. My name is Pranav Kothari, and I'm the CEO of Educational Initiatives. EI's mission is to see a world where children everywhere are learning with understanding. We do this by making student assessments and an adaptive learning software called MindSpark. EI Dialogue started out with an endeavor to bring conversations that are usually held in closed doors, where people are willing to share the what, when, where, how they've managed to sort of scale organizations. It's a place where I am trying to find insights that they've accumulated from their years of work on the ground and bring them to you. I hope you enjoy watching these. Today I have the pleasure of interacting with Omar Momin, who is the CEO of Godrej Foundation. Omar is a very thoughtful person. In my interactions so far, I've found him to read, to understand, visit the field, and really question whether the intervention will have a long-lasting positive effect on the entire population. He has been evaluating a variety of different theories of change. I'm curious about what makes teachers effective, what are training programs that actually improve learning outcomes. Omar has also sort of studied a lot of literature on what works and what doesn't. So I want to ask him about how does he look at impact measurement and what are some things that often get missed. One favorite topic of mine is technology in education. And I'd love to hear from him on how does he see both the possibility as well as the risks of using technology as well as generative AI in education. Thank you for coming to EI Dialogues, Omar, and it's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you, Pranav.
So Omar, you've been looking at the education sector. Would love to understand how did you decide to fund here? What was your thought? What was the intention? What were you hoping to accomplish?
Thank you. So I've spent about 15 years doing different roles on the business side within the Godrej Group. And there was always a sense that if you think about education as one of the most fundamental rights to opportunity, there was a thought on what could we do potentially to improve educational outcomes for children across the board and see more and more kids benefit out of the opportunities that a good education provides. As I started understanding the space about 10 years ago, we realized that the momentum in terms of kids getting into private schools was an increasing phenomenon. And we wanted to understand whether learning outcomes in private schools were better than those in public schools, and what could we do to potentially see what increase in learning outcomes could be driven by. What we did is first try to understand just the idea of learning outcomes in the space. And I think we had some benchmarks from research that was done in both the public and private space. There was an argument that outcomes in the private space were higher than that in the public space, but mostly driven by home effects. And the other thing that most people didn't realize was that private schools are not the private schools that most of us understand at private schools. The majority of private schools are what are called budget private schools or affordable private schools, where fees are typically 500 to 1,000 rupees a month, where teacher salaries are between 5 and 10,000 rupees a month. And that's where the majority of the ecosystem operates at in terms of price points. So we started a set of experiments with different kinds of interventions, whether it was teacher training, whether it was products that help with teaching materials, and tried to see what could make a difference to the space. That was the beginning of my journey.
Thank you for sharing that. And as you sort of went through this, what worked, what didn't, what worked under what circumstances? Would love to learn more.
Yeah. I think in the private space, the biggest learning for us was that teacher capacity was one of the most powerful drivers of student learning outcomes, but not in the way it's been historically done. I think the idea of a one-off training, not followed up by anything else, has been shown to not improve learning outcomes materially at all. What we've seen is when you invest in the feedback loop that starts with training, goes on to observation, goes on to feedback to teachers, and then do that in a sustained way for about 80 hours per teacher, that's when you can build teacher capacity to a level where he or she can actually deliver on student learning outcomes, especially for the lower grades in terms of foundational literacy and numeracy.
We have also seen that, helping teachers on the concepts that they're about to teach in the following 1 or 2 weeks has been sort of more impactful as it comes to teacher training. So largely, if a teacher is teaching decimals the next week, can today she get a sense of based on previous assessments, what are those mistakes that students make? Also, bite-sized that they're able to retain for the next 1 or 2 weeks when they're about to teach is much better than like a large dose upfront. So basically, teacher training that's concept-specific, just-in-time, bite-size, based on previous student data, with proven methods to remediate, turns out to be one of the most effective forms of teacher training that we can provide to teachers. What else have been some findings from your experiments in working with the schools as you've evaluated this?
I think as you kind of think of the public school space, one of the challenges that we have across many states is the presence of what's called multi-grade classrooms. So typically any primary school would have between 2 and 3 teachers across 5 grades. You have incentive and accountability structures that are different in the public space as compared to the private space. And I think having seen some of the research where one has been able to move learning outcomes at the foundational level, at the level of a couple of blocks in a district, what seems to be the ingredients of better learning outcome systems are structured pedagogy, are getting into this idea of teacher training followed by feedback and then closing that loop, a focus on remediation as structured part of weekly plans, and a governance structure that has some emphasis on student learning as well as some of the process metrics that the state does need to track.
And do you think this works at the level of a block, a district, a state, under what conditions?
I think a lot of the initial knowledge got generated at the level of blocks. And in the last 5 years, I think we've moved that to both districts, as well as now we have a number of programs under the Nipun Bharat mission at the level of states that have seen material improvement. So I think we have the methodology largely in place. We need to keep at it because it is a long-term process, and it is still one of the most fundamental elements of what we need for a strong foundation in the education system. But there seems to be evidence that if we stick with it with the right structures in public systems, we can move the needle.
So Omar, imagine today's your lucky day. You are a principal secretary of a medium to large state in India. What would you do? What would you change? Like, what's your mandate to your lieutenants?
I think directionally, some of the ideas that at least I have started to propose or believe in would be that we have a very process-driven structure today. We have the opportunity to think of a much more focused curriculum. We should have the ability for principals to be able to organize their schools and teachers, especially given multi-grade classrooms, in a way that could promote teaching at the right level. I think Pratham has showed how powerful that can be. And if you didn't have the constraints of having grade level organization of children, but instead having children organized by learning levels, you could get far more effective learning. And it speaks more importantly to the idea that if teachers have agency, if school principals have agency, and are measured by learning outcomes and more outcome-driven methods, then you have the idea of a purpose in that system that could drive towards more defined changes. They don't have to complete the syllabus, as it were, and we could see a much greater impact on learning with the current context. I think those would be some of the directions that I felt strongly about. What would your sense be?
I thought teachers already have so much latitude, right? They come in when they please, they do what they please. There's nobody really seeing them. Even principals are left to do. At least when I walk in, I feel like there isn't really a lot of oversight, although they do complain about this. But practically speaking, on a random day, do they not have a lot of autonomy already?
I think there are constraints on the fact that there still needs to be organization by grade. Yes. The idea of grouping kids by learning levels and explaining why that is important to their stakeholders, including parents, is some of the flexibility that I think is still not part of the conversation. So I think while they have agency in the classroom they're assigned to, I think one could think of a lot more flexibility and agency, even working with some of the programs that they're assigned to from time to time.
Yeah. Well, I am in favor of sort of teaching, grouping students by their learning levels and helping them learn forward from there. But I think just the counter argument on that and why RTE was put in and why there was automatic promotion is that students of similar age groups sort of go together, and then you don't have like a 12-year-old sitting next to a 6-year-old and the social dynamics from there. So that would be the trade-off that one would have to agree to make.
Absolutely. I think we have to find space for the extremes, but I think just the idea of greater flexibility, I think would do a fair bit to the focus on learning outcomes.
Yeah. I think there are a couple of interesting experiments that we have seen at the state level. One was in Gujarat in the 2010 to 15 era, where all state officers, regardless of whether you are education department, health department, forest department, would spend 3 days at a school.
Yeah.
And they would ask students questions directly. And I think it really increased the sensitization of officers of the real learning levels of the students. And I think that is an important one. I think second was just a focus on learning outcomes as measured by tests. And this can be done by teachers. It can be done by that. We can run like a loose census to sort of just bring the focus on learning, as opposed to checking for walls and toilets and checking for compliances. Of course, for learning levels itself, like a tight sample might be more useful. But yeah, I think as simple as it sounds, just a greater orientation towards learning outcomes with the support provided by the system, which are curated materials, like you said, structured pedagogy, might help tremendously in improving learning. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think teachers also have a very different set of objectives when they are assessed or they are thought of in relation to assessments. I think the idea that formative assessment should be just an ongoing part of pedagogy. It shouldn't be high stakes, and those should be separated from the more summative and relatively higher stake assessments is also an important part of this equation. I think some of our assessments have become just too high stakes and they lose fidelity because of that. Just making it normal, making it something that should be bite-sized, incremental, taking into account where kids actually are, would just help bring greater fidelity and accountability to this loop.
Modern technology can help in that we have seen everything from OMRs that can be scanned with the teacher's smartphone. Now even OCR is getting better, where children's handwriting can be detected through generative AI.
Yes.
We've seen clickers where every student can choose an answer choice, and in real time the teacher gets this. So I think decreasing stakes as well as decreasing the effort to do formative assessment, I think we're seeing rapid progress. I think this needs to be coupled with remediation instructions for the teachers on what they have to do basis the results that come out. And I think that would be quite a game changer.
Absolutely.
So, as the principal secretary, like you have rolled out these changes, how would you measure whether your decisions had a material impact or not?
So I think one thing in the space of education, just thinking about the framework of assessment, is to not miss out on the fact that in the absence of any intervention, kids still continue to learn. So the idea that one has to think of a counterfactual where an intervention is absent as compared to when you're doing an intervention, which is the fundamental design of randomized controlled trials as coming from the field of medicine. At least, even if one doesn't go to the extent of fully designing these in a research or in an academic fashion, just having that ability to think of assessment in that framework of what would have been a counterfactual and how does one think of the impact one's efforts are having is important in this space. And then having a sense of what would materiality mean. I think in many cases, we're looking at very low baseline levels of learning. And I think while there could be changes that are statistically significant, they might not be material in the larger scheme of things. So for example, today we have about a quarter of our kids in grade 2 and 3 that are at grade level or foundationally competent. Now, even if we move the needle from, let's say, 25 to 30, it might be statistically significant, but it's not material in where we want to go. So having both a lens of the counterfactual as well as a sense of materiality are, I think, two broad principles that we advocate with our partners whenever we're thinking about assessment.
And why is materially significant important? Like, why are you not happy with just 25% going to 30% or 40%?
I think the principle of working on foundational learning is that we should have all kids being able to do basic math operations or being able to read, which is the foundation of all of their future learning. So from grade 4 onwards, the assumption is that you've learned to read and then you're reading to learn. And in the absence of that, you have a very, very high probability that you get left behind in the higher grades without understanding what's going on in class. And therefore, if you think of what we need is numbers that are closer to 100%, and even if we get to 50%, that is doubling the current baseline, but that's still as much far away as we need to be, which is why I think when we're thinking of this as the basis for change and future outcomes for kids, I think the movements on this particular metric have to be material, while in many other fields, like medicine, for example, just statistically significant improvement is enough.
Yeah, and one other framework that I like to think on these is there enough escape velocity, right? So sometimes we ask, like, out of, let's say, 26 alphabets in English, one group learned 13, the other learned 20, which one's better? And you can argue 20, but the point is it's still too low, right?
Yes.
Unless you achieve a certain level of mastery, there's a chance that the learning might retard, or there's a chance that that itself is not sufficient to go above a certain threshold on which you're a productive working citizen in the country.
Well, that's a great element of the assessment framework, which is that especially in the lower grades, I think scores and grades are not as effective as mastery in terms of the framework, and just having kids move on to the next competency once they've mastered one should be the framework to think of, as compared to whether, like you said, 25 on 40 is a better score than 15 on 40.
Yeah.
So Pranav, as you've looked at assessments from your experience, what are some of the principles, learnings that you've had in terms of what people often miss out or should keep in mind?
Yeah, we talk to many organizations that come to us to measure the impact of their interventions. And I have to remind them that even without their presence, there is at least some learning happening. There are teachers who are coming and teaching, and whatever little, or it's not zero. And sometimes, like when we are measuring the impact of an intervention, it's important that we net it out against business as usual, schooling as usual learning gains. The best way to do this is before the start of the intervention to start out with double the number of schools or double the number of districts that one intends to operate, and randomize and choose a control group, because then at baseline, both of them are same. So any government schemes, any nutrition schemes, any educational interventions, any policies are then equally applicable to both. Now, when we measure at end line the gain, the subtraction between what the intervention gained to the control gained has a higher attribution towards the intervention that was done. So many of them come to us after they've finished 3 years of work, and that tends to not allow for the randomization to come, and then you have to do other things like picking comparison groups or against meta-studies, which is never as robust as giving the attribution to the organization that they are looking for. In one other instance, we've had organizations say, hey, we worked here for 5 years, why is our learning levels still lower than the average? And, in those cases, I have to remind them that maybe when they started, it was below average, or it was average, or it was above average. But I can't answer that unless, you have those things. And then there's disappointment because there's years of hard work and strategy and resources at play, and donors want this answer.
Yeah.
So I think the easiest thing is catch evaluation agencies early on. Think about this before. That sows the seeds for things to come later.
Absolutely. No, I think just being early and careful about thinking on impact right from the beginning is so important. I think in the space of education, two things that are a factor, characteristics of the system get missed out. One, that you have kids learning through a journey of schooling in any case without any interventions, like you said, and the fact that every year you have a new cohort of kids. And logically, both of those have to be accounted for when you're thinking of impact. So like you said, the fact that if you're doing something, is it better than if they didn't have this intervention, is just such an important frame to think about in the assessment framework.
And it's possible that very intuitive things can also have no impact, and that might be very hard to digest. So Dr. Karthik Muralidharan has this famous study called Double for Nothing, where they actually doubled teachers' pay in Indonesia, and it led to zero learning outcome gain. And that's such a non-intuitive thing, because you go around the world, people think that by paying more, you'll get more motivated teachers, but not everything works based on intuition or logic. You have to experiment, you have to test it out.
Absolutely. And I think some of these causal events in terms of the hypothesis are multi-chain events, right? You believe that because you're going to train teachers or pay them a certain amount, they're going to behave a certain way. That behavior will translate into something into the classroom. It'll affect learning outcomes in certain ways. And each of these are links in a chain that can break down for different reasons that you might not think about. So making sure that you're clear on the end objective and testing the hypothesis is important so that you allocate resources effectively.
Yeah, in fact, also the amount of resource it took to get that gain. So you might see a positive impact,
Yes.
but is it worth the dollar against
Absolutely.
other choices that might exist? And I think one final nuance is how much of this is residual gain, which is after you have left the system, 3 years later, 5 years later, did what you change happen only during the intervention time?
Yes.
Or did it have a lasting impact? Is also another consideration that often gets missed out.
Correct. Absolutely right. You often have things change just because you're measuring them, because there's a certain amount of focus that so many stakeholders are bringing in that is otherwise not part of the usual flow of work.
That's right. Umar, what else are you excited about? What, as you see the space and you've looked at the landscape of different interventions in different states, in different sizes, and different grades, cross-cutting, is there a topic that sort of excites you most?
I think as we've thought about a lot of the programs at scale, they're basically focused on moving median outcomes higher if you think of the distribution of outcomes. And I think one thing that gets often missed out is the idea that a lot of disproportionate impact on the world in any field is brought about by those who excel in it. So if you think about economies and firms, the largest firms, the most innovative companies have the most disproportionate impact on any country. Even within a firm, the people who are driving what matters most to the business, the top 10% of performers, have the most impact on a business. If you look at the distribution of tennis players, or if you look at the distribution of artists, you have the top 5% of people that have a disproportionate outcome on that field. And I think if you apply that lens to education, we believe it's important to identify children who have high potential in different facets. So the idea of identifying bright kids, bright in different ways, from disadvantaged backgrounds, and supporting them to their full potential for what it can do, not just to them and their families, but potentially for society at large, is an idea that we feel strongly about. And we're thinking of creating this as a theme that we want to take to a larger plane.
Finding that the top 10% in any distribution tends to have a disproportionate sort of impact on the rest of the thing. And the chances that the brightest students today will be future leaders in politics and government and industry, religion, any sports, any of those fields, merits the need to identify them through rigorous testing, and then nurture that giftedness so that they actually achieve that full potential. My sense is that if you don't identify them and nurture them, they may regress to the median as well, because they were sort of never done. And while talent is equally distributed, opportunity to nourish that talent isn't. And hence, in low-income students, we need to sort of discover this quickly, support them at the level and the conditions that they are in, so that they also sort of rise to the greatness that sort of they have within them.
And there's a very interesting dichotomy between thinking about equity and the fact that you have this kind of the top 5% that matters. I think the way we think about that is that every child is in the top 5% of something. And I think identifying all those different distributions and then making sure that the child has the ability to be top 5% in his or her distribution of choice is how equity is taken care of. But at the same time, within a distribution, it's important to focus on that right tail, on that top 5%, to say, how do you ensure that that ability is taken to its full potential? Once you identify a great tennis player or a badminton player, the kind of effort that goes into making them world champions is not to be underestimated.
But Omar, I can understand that, to find the PV Sindhu and help her become the greatest player sort of doesn't necessarily put the others at health risk or a disadvantage, right? But in the education system, if you were to focus only on the top 5%, do we not want the remaining 95% to also achieve reasonably good education, where they become productive citizens, where they're able to get gainful employment? Wouldn't channelizing all or majority of the resources on the top 5%, create an environment where we have a large majority that is just nobody is willing to pay them for their skills?
No, I think the disproportionate aspect is only relative to their representation, right? So if you think of, let's say, 100 units, the fact is you will always allocate 80 to 90 units to the majority of kids in terms of resourcing. But even if you allocate 10 units or 15 units to the top 5%, I think that could have a disproportionate impact on all of these fields and therefore multiplicatively on their communities and societies, because you're allowing for the expression of excellence, which is what drives success both in their community or the world at large.
And what does this investment look like? Like, what would we do with these academically gifted students? Like, what are sensible sort of strategies to support them, especially when they come from low-income backgrounds?
I think from the research so far, there are a couple of elements that form the structure of nurturing, like you mentioned. I think having the idea of acceleration, so getting them exposure to whether it's academics or sports, a couple of levels higher than where they are. So acceleration is an important part of that journey towards excellence. The other thing is creation of a peer group. So how do you bring kids who are in that top 5% together, have them learn from each other, push each other, and build a community, so to say, of such kids who are pursuing that common passion is a second element. And I think the third element is the idea of exposure. I think we have education systems that are often very narrow in terms of what they focus on for a certain grade. But there are so many topics that are not part of standard curriculum that can be completely eye-opening for kids. It can inspire them to do things that they otherwise wouldn't have thought of. So just exposure to a very wide range of topics and experts in those topics serve as inspiration for what they might otherwise not aspire to. So acceleration, exposure, and a peer group, I think, are three elements of what we'd understand as essential to this process.
Yeah, we saw some of this when Duke University came to India and wanted to work on the talent identification program, a program that they've run successfully in the US for more than 50 years. We were able to identify some of the best 7th graders from the country and bring them together. When I met some of them, I realized that these are like the padaku kidas that I had in my class. These are the types of people who wouldn't get invited to all the birthday parties. But suddenly now they found their tribe, right? So they may have been 1 out of 40 in their class. They might even have been 1 out of 100 in their school. But just the fact that now they are at a similar sort of resonant frequency with others, this peer group continued even after the 3-week residential program got over. I know the US has a lot of documented evidence on gifted with Johns Hopkins, Northwestern, UC Berkeley. And in India, we've also been tracking it for the last 10, 15 years to see some very positive results on this.
Yeah, I think the world does it so naturally, let's say, in areas like the Olympics, where it's well understood as to what it takes to create Olympians. I think applying some of those principles to other fields would actually lead to, as it were, the pursuit of excellence for kids in what they really are passionate about. And it just makes for a very interesting distribution of excellence in very different distributions.
Yeah, I think there'll be more magic that comes when you have excellence with diversity. So, for example, let's say there are 2 students from the Cathedral School in Mumbai. What they would learn from each other would be something. But if they were coupled with an equally bright kid from a rural part of Bihar or Telangana, I think the learning for both of them would be much higher. What's happening today is there is more safety that's been played, especially by, let's say, foreign universities. They're recruiting from the same school in the absence of data of where other bright equally bright kids might be. So I think there's an opportunity where you find the brightest children from all over India, regardless of their socioeconomic background, and do interventions with them that helps us get more patents, more entrepreneurship, which in turn will have spillover effects on the remaining 95% also.
Absolutely. Nobel Prize winners, Olympiad winners, all of these are possible. And I think it starts with the principle that talent is distributed normally in any population. It's just that the access to opportunity, the access to support gets distinguished or differentiated along lines of income. And I think it's imperative for us as a country to make sure that where we have so much of such talent distributed all across the country, how do we make sure that they are identified and expressed to their full potential to the extent possible?
Yeah. And one last sad, interesting finding from our study was that the top 1% of the government school student was only at the 25th percentile of the private school system. So there is this very large gap, even today, amongst the brightest, but we must continue to find this talent and grow this. And according to the global definitions of gifted, we're talking something like the top 1% here. So it's not the top 10, 15, it's the top 1% into which we would do. And of course, in a large country like ours, that itself would be hundreds of thousands of students.
Very large numbers, indeed. So Pranav, there's a new kid on the block, AI. How do you think of the impact that AI could have on education? What does it mean for all the different stakeholders in the system? Just your thoughts so far?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this new kid. I've embraced it. No, I think it's really unlocking our dreams that we've had for a long time on helping students improve their speaking, improve their structured writing, improve reading comprehension in ways that was not possible, even if we had the intention. So let's say 20 years ago, we wanted to give students feedback when they spoke, as an English teacher would. But the only way you could do that is by hiring very expensive English tutors who would do this, and it would have to be synchronous, and they would have to sort of do it all of this time. But because now voice recognition has gotten very good and generative AI's ability to handle unstructured text has gotten very good, we're able to give feedback as well as an English teacher in 30 seconds or so. And it's done in a very safe space, in a non-judgmental, with empathy, sort of prompt engineered into it. So the chances that the child will use the tool again and again is much higher, because the fear factor of sort of being able to get reprimanded by an adult sort of goes away.
Absolutely. And I think just thinking about the holy grail of personalized learning, each child being able to learn at his or her pace in directions that he or she might want to take their own learning is transformative at the student level. And what it also does is raise some very interesting questions for our systemic choices, right? What I mean by that is you have had historically constraints when you're trying to scale with good capacity. It's like, it's difficult to have very good doctors in very small towns. It's difficult to have very good teachers in every village or town in India. And what one could do with the emergence and adaptation of AI is, in a way, solve for this constraint at a systemic level. You now have the ability to have very high quality, supported, led by a physical teacher who need not be at the same quality as the best teacher in the country. But you have the knowledge in the system to be able to be complemented by a human being. And then think about what that means for productivity, for school economics as well. So we could be at a place where finally you ask the question on, at 1,000 rupees per child, could you make good quality happen? This could be one of the enablers that we see AI make happen potentially in the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I like the fact that in technology, you can centralize quality with a group of experts, with data, and then disseminate it at scale without loss of fidelity. And as India's GDP per capita will grow, We have already seen emergence of 5G everywhere. I believe that smartphones, tablets, computers will be very ubiquitous with that. And then all of that pipeline has been created to then supply quality education. And I think technology should help a teacher achieve his or her intent. And in that regard, I feel that technology/AI can be a great digital tutor for every child, a digital assistant for every teacher, and a digital dashboard for every administrator to be able to ensure high quality education. And that might be the first time we achieve equity in education in a very cost effective manner, which can be proven to really lift the tide.
Absolutely. Yet at the same time, we should be careful not to think of it as a panacea for all our problems, to be careful in terms of the fact that it doesn't end up being a crutch wherein you don't build the muscles to be able to think, to be able to scaffold your learning. You can't have it as an element that just provides answers. And I think it just is an opportunity for us to rethink education overall, starting with the journey and the safety as well of the child in mind, to think of what it means to be a productive adult 5-10 years down the line. How do you think of just the skills that we thought of education providing, having its roots in the Industrial Revolution? How do you see that fundamentally changing, if at all? Because the tools we'll have access to, this generation will have access to as adults, will be of a whole different order of magnitude as compared to earlier generations.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know the answer. I would have liked to say critical thinking, but then the more I use GPT-4o's critical thinking skills, I'm wondering what it is. But I think good citizenship, good values, maybe even problems that AI is not able to solve based on past data, collaborating with other humans. Yes. To be able to solve wicked problems. Because, I mean, on one side, you do have new problems emerging, like climate and others, and those won't be solved just by generative AI models. It would be solved by both thinking and behavior change of humans, right? And I think those are areas that humans would have to solve those problems for themselves, for the planet, for future generations that pan out.
Yeah, it's such a great opportunity for entrepreneurs who are thinking of setting up schools or thinking about being part of school systems to actually reimagine schools, to reimagine what in-school learning, after-school learning, just enrichment programs for young adults. There is so much of space that now opens up, keeping in mind some of these skills that the adults of tomorrow will potentially need.
Yeah, one must question everything. Like, for example, why should all students have the same textbook?
Correct.
Whose convenience is it? Except for the publisher who gets economies of scale, there's absolutely no reason for that. And I think with generative AI, you can hyper-personalize this, right? Every child can be subject to learning the same competencies, the same skills, but in ways that sort of are personalized to their level, to the level of emotional support, their interest areas. And generative AI can do this in a beautiful way. So I think reimagining everything, questioning everything from the factory system schooling that we have right now is a great opportunity of generative AI. I also think there are some risks to AI that we will have to solve for. One is that a lot of generative AI is based on existing text, which means it multiplies the bias, misinformation, any kind of reliance. And I think that needs to be corrected for. I also like what Professor Ethan Malik talked about, 3 illusions that happens in schooling with generative AI. One is the homework illusion, which means that teachers think that students are doing the homework when they're not. Second is teachers think they can catch the GPT homework, but they can't because there are multi-agents now working together. And third, I think, is that students think they've understood the matter just because they've used GPT to solve it, but that also is illusory knowledge, as he calls it. So I think we need to find ways to do this. And one way to do that is to have these guardrails through prompt engineering. So think about when videos first came out, all of this was still a concern. But like if you log into the Khan Academy and watch videos, you are in a safe zone, right? Similarly with generative AI, what we're thinking about is once you've logged into MindSpark, you're in the safe zone where there's no bias. You're not just using it as a crutch and many of those things, but you're doing the deliberative practice, right? The productive struggle as some cause to enable learning to happen. So yeah, overall very excited. Can't wait to see this kid grow up. And I think it can both enhance the quality and the equity in education.
Indeed, we learn every day.
Thank you, Omar, for coming today. It was a really good conversation. I enjoyed learning about all the insights you've gained from considering a variety of investments and choosing to make a few of them. In particular, I understood that for teacher training, while it seems like an obvious thing and seems like the focal attention, it's effective only when it's sustained, when feedback loops are closed, when there's greater autonomy to do things at the last mile, coupled with, let's say, technical knowledge being improved through concept-specific material that they get. I also, both of us get approached by nonprofits, you for funding, me for evaluation, and we learned the importance of having a counterfactual, comparing against business as usual, because positive gains are happening regardless of whether we are there or not. Of course, not to the same magnitude that we would like. And like the fact that intuitive things may not always have the most cost-effective, impact on learning. Within that, I learned about how the top 1% might actually have the answer on improving learning levels for the remaining 99%. Again, counterintuitive to what most programs focus on, which is shifting the entire, or working on the entire bell curve. And finally, I think, both the opportunities and threats of using technology in education. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And thank you for coming to EI Dialogues. Omar, it was great to have you here.
Thank you, Pranav. It was a very good conversation. It was also good to hear some of your experiences in this space. And I think it's something that it would be great to build together towards a journey where, like you said, the mission of EI is one of the most inspiring ones that we'd all want to see happen.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind words.